الحمد لله وكفى وسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى أما بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فاعتبروا يا أولو الأبصار سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم. There are many different challenges facing the religion of Islam, and the many different challenges facing individual Muslims. And sometimes when we confront these different challenges, sometimes when we identify possible solutions to these different challenges, sometimes a person can get confused as to what is a solution to what type of particular challenge. And specifically, when we look at the twin wings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, which is ilm and dhikr, or knowledge and spirituality, knowledge and worship, knowledge and taqwa, knowledge and piety, sometimes it's not clearly apparent to what extent knowledge can be used and to what extent ibadah and zikr have to be used. And sometimes people might confuse two of these things, or sometimes people might get confused about these two approaches. So let's say somebody was to put forth the following proposition, is that there's secular modernity, and secular modernity poses a whole set of questions for any and all faiths, and that includes the religion of Islam. That is certainly true, but to what extent can those questions be countered, and to what extent can those questions be understood even, let alone answered, without any ibadah and without any spirituality? That needs to be investigated. So the first thing we should understand is that there are two types of farz al-ayn and farz al-kifaya. Farz al-ayn is that thing which is obligatory in every single Muslim. There is nobody who can stipulate that it is obligatory or mandatory upon every single Muslim to be able to answer every question that any non-Muslim or any Western, secular, or any non-Islamic ideology presents to Islam. There's no way a Muslim needs to answer that, and the haqq or the haqqaniyya or the truth of the deen of Islam is not predicated in any way upon having that answer yourself or having even that answer articulated by others. In other words, the deen of Islam is haqq, irrespective of whether or not you or me might have an answer to each and every individual or collective question that is presented to us by people who are outside or sometimes even inside the fold of Islam. So the question then, is it a fardh kifaya? Is it necessary that there should be a member, a group of people in the ummah who have such a level of intellectual sophistication and academic ability to answer every single question and challenge that Islam has presented? It really depends how you look at it. And the reality is that if you look in our Muslim history, certainly Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah studied Greek logic, studied Aristotelian logic, studied Aristotelian philosophy. But he used that to augment, not to replace, to augment his grounding in the Qur'an and Sunnah. Because contrary to popular misconception that, okay, the deen can only take you so far, and now you have to take Western sources to take you the rest of the way, we would actually say it's completely the opposite. That the Western social sciences can only take you so far and they fall short. And it's actually the superior type of ilm, which is revelation, wahi, and prophecy, nubuwah, that actually brings a human being to a complete understanding of the ideal concept of humanity, or the ideal society, or the ideal political, etc. type of system. So Imam al-Ghazali used some of those things, but he used it to refute certain theological sects that existed in his time. The critical thing to understand, and every honest student of history would have to acknowledge this, Imam al-Ghazali did not even attempt to write a refutation of Aristotelian metaphysics. I should again explain, sometimes I mentioned this to you about 4 weeks ago or maybe 6 weeks ago, that from time to time we will talk about things that are a bit more academic or whatever, ilmi in nature. Every week we're not going to do a very spiritual ibadah, zikr, feel-good type of bayan, right? Because just like this whole purpose of this talk is actually to suggest that we need to use both of these tools, ilm and ibadah, but we have to understand to what extent each of these tools can be applied. So today really is to trying to understand the rabt, or in some cases the dissonance between these two approaches. So the early ulama studied these things, but they studied them to complement their existing knowledge. They studied them just as asbab. They didn't, in other words, they studied them, as we would say, لغيره, not لنفسه. They didn't study them in of themselves, as they viewed these types of non-revealed sciences as having any merit or virtue in of themselves, but they studied those as means and methods, perhaps to attain a goal that was desired or even in some sense obligated by the Qur'an and the Sharia. So Imam Ghazali has never tried, and you will not find other of our great thinkers who have tried to do this refutation. That said, right, what about the current time, right? What about secularism? What about quote-unquote modernity? What about postmodernism? What about beyond postmodernism? What about cosmopolitanism? What about pragmatism? What about pragmaticism? What about empiricism? What about nihilism? What about atheism, agnosticism? All of these different things. Does Islam have to answer them in such a way that all of these people would do sajda to you? Is this the determinant for what is the haqqaniyat of Islam? It's impossible. That is what we call qiyas ma al-fariq. What happened with the Anbiya is totally different. And no Muslim, right, there is no way you can refute the theory of evolution on their terms. That is a critical difference that our elders made, and even the great scholars of today, the principal two, maybe who are the foremost in English who are in this tradition, are Timothy Winter and Sherman Jackson. Timothy Winter and Sherman Jackson, Abdul Hakim Murad, and also Abdul Hakim Jackson, they both happen to have taken the same Muslim name, Abdul Hakim. Both of these scholars actually, number one, are deeply grounded in the Arabic language. Number two, are deeply grounded in the entire Islamic intellectual tradition, not just one or two people like Shatibi or Baqillani or Ibn Khaldun, but they're deeply grounded in the whole tradition. And what they have not tried to do, right, Sherman Jackson has not tried to refute secularism, right, but what he's done rather is that individual Muslims who might be educated, Muslims like you and me who are either products of or currently going through a secular liberal arts education, the type of questions and challenges they face. Is there a way that we can, using our own Islamic discourse, using our own first principles, bolster that Muslim in the face of this onslaught? And that is what Timothy Winter and Sherman Jackson do, right? They do not attempt to use Max Weber or other philosophers and to argue with those people on their terms, because that is impossible to do. Let me give you the example that I took of evolution, right? It is in no way required for Islam to put out a refutation of evolution that would entail evolutionary biologists doing sajda to the Muslim scholars who put forth this alternative theory. Obviously, I'm not talking of physical sajda, that's obviously not allowed. I'm talking about if somebody makes the argument that the magicians did sajda to Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam, the poets did sajda to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the people of Tib, the people of medicine did sajda to Isa alayhi salam. First of all, these were anbiya, right? We are totally different from them. If you look at each of the things that they did sajda to, they actually weren't doing sajda to the Zat of the Nabi. They were doing sajda to the mu'jiza, the miracle that was bestowed upon that Prophet by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because it wasn't Rasul's poetry that won the contest, it was the Qur'an al-Kareem, right? That's the Kalamullah, it's not Kalami-Rasul, right? And similarly, it wasn't Sayyidina Musa's own inherent ability. That was a mu'jiza that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him, that when he casted his staff, it would turn into a real serpent that would devour the tricks and the machinations of the pagan Egyptian magicians. And that was a miracle that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him, that when he put his hands in his pocket or when he took his hands out, they would be shining with a white nur. Similarly, Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam, not in his own inherent ability was he able to revive the dead, or cure the blind, or cure the leper. This was something, a mu'jiza that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them, and mu'jizas only occur for the anbiya. And all of these mu'jizas were non-intellectual feats. To do qiyas on this and to think that somehow we can reach an intellectual endeavor through our own brain, right, through our own aql that matches the mu'jizat of the anbiya, that is really a far-fetched claim to make in this deen of Islam. And there's why is it that you cannot entirely refute evolution on their terms? Because really it comes down to your first terms. Now let's look at the theory of human evolution. And this is something I studied. I made it a point at the University of Chicago. I took evolutionary biology and I took human genetics. Because geneticists at that time actually contested what is actually known as the fossil theory of human evolution. Now you have certain geneticists who are trying to pair the two. And this is still a current debate in the field of genetics. The fossil theory of human evolution Simply, and let's separate this out, Islam is not against Darwinian theory of natural selection. That's not an issue, right? That is common sense. That's perfectly fine. That if there were giraffes of different, there were different types of giraffes, right? Some of them had long necks, some of them didn't. And those giraffes who had long necks, they survived because they were able to eat whatever the leaves on taller branches. That is perfectly acceptable in Islam. That within a species, certain characteristic traits are preferred and they last longer because of the theory of the survival of the fittest, and hence those fittest who survive, their characteristic traits are propagated through their genes and through reproduction. Islam is also okay with evolution across species. In the following sense, for example, you take animals that were amphibian, and there were in the amphibian species there were certain animals who, for whatever reason, and science doesn't give you any reason for this, for whatever reason they chose to hang out more in the water. So when they chose to hang out more in the water, those of their attributes that were more conducive to aquatic life became reproduced in their progeny, because those who didn't have those attributes would die out and will not live long enough to have young. Similarly, in that same amphibian species, those members of that species who chose to hang out, so to speak, more on land, their attributes, those members of that group whose attributes were more conducive to surviving on land propagated those attributes. In the end, you actually ended up with two different species, one which was completely land-based and one which is completely aquatic. It's the theory of human evolution that Islam has a problem with, and the problem that Islam has with it is not logical, no matter how many logical reasons we can give. And I'm going to come to that because you would have noticed sometimes in my class also, I do give you logical reasons, but there's a limit to rationalization, justification, and logical arguments in understanding the deen. Now, the fossil theory of human evolution, right, basically they've discovered different fossils. All they can say conclusively, scientifically, is that, okay, you have primates, whether it's apes, orangutans, and I can't remember, and I think it's an orangutan, which is actually the most developed form, but whatever it is, it's a chimpanzee, ape, or gorilla, that has a particular type of skeletal structure. Then you have the current skeletal structure of a human being. And then you find these fossils that you can date back 5,000 years, 10,000 years, Cro-Magnon man, Neanderthal man, etc., right? And those fossils are actually... the skeletal structure of those fossils seem like there's something in between. They're not 100% like our current skeletal structure, especially in terms of curvature of the spine, but they're not entirely like. So what they stipulate is that maybe there's this intermediate type of skeletal structure. That you cannot logically prove to that intermediate skeletal structure was the forefather of human beings. That could have just been another species of ape or gorilla that died out, right? One response I will give you is that no, for example, those of you who follow the news very recently, they discovered a fossil of a couple of two skeletons which are buried, or not buried rather, two skeletons which were discovered as if they were like lying in an embrace. And if you read the article, it actually says that they don't think that they were buried alive in an embrace, but that they died together, and because of the love they had for one another, the people buried them together in this way as it looks like they're embracing one another. So obviously that suggests intelligent life, right? It's only intelligent life forms that bury their dead, and that would actually have this emotional sensitivity to bury their dead in such a way that reflects the relationship they had with them. So there are two possibilities here, right? One is what they say is, okay, there was some type of semi-intelligent life form, and that is really the missing link between the primates, the gorilla system, and human beings. And that means that human beings evolved from apes. There's another possibility, is that, again, the first possibility was that was some other species altogether that weren't humans. The other possibility is that we're willing to allow that human beings might have had a different skeletal structure, because the Qur'an al-Karim gives some leeway to that. Many of you would know that there's a very clear ayah that unequivocally states that the age of Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam was 950 years. Now if he was 950 years, there are again two possibilities. Number one, that physiologically speaking he was a different type of human being that you and me are. That is possible. The second possibility is simply that was the hukam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that possibly for him, or some hadith suggests that this was maybe the norm in his ummah. So perhaps for all the human beings at the time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala simply slowed the aging process, right? Just imagine that the normal process in which you and me age, in which we become whatever, sort of very old or wrinkled by the age we're 70, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reduced that process or by a factor of 1 to 15, then it's possible that somebody would actually be able to live 950 years. But So it is also in theory possible, we would have no problem with that early human beings had a slightly different skeletal structure. And we have no problem, we actually ourselves believe that when Sayyidina Adam a.s. came to this world, there was very little technology. So if in these early human beings you find a flint axe or you find a simple type of tool, that's perfectly fine for us as well. What's not acceptable is the following, and there's no way that you can logically convince an evolutionary scientist of what I'm about to tell you.